The question for the hour, are the media about to help Trump fail his way back into the White House? This is just, you've been hearing me rant about media and the headlines, and particularly in the New York Times and the Washington Post for the better part of a month now, at least. Michael Tomasky is the editor of the New Republic, newrepublic.com, which occasionally publishes my work as well. Great publication. If you don't subscribe to it, you should. As I said, newrepublic.com. They've been around for like 119 years, I think. Great publication. And Michael has a brilliant piece out about this. I wanted to get him on. His Twitter handle is mtomasky, Tomasky, or at New Republic. Michael, welcome back to the program. Tell us about this. How can the media help Donald Trump fail back into office? It's a provocative headline, too.
I think we all see this every day, and your listeners, I'm sure, are driven crazy by it as I am and as you are. They do these false equivalence stories, or they do these stories that, they think, oh, we wrote something tough about Trump, we better write something tough, at least as tough about Harris. And it produces this stuff that just is crazy and just doesn't reflect reality. She's not, whatever she is, and she has her strengths and weaknesses like any politician, but she's not, a doddering person who, talks about, sharks and electrocution and Hannibal Lecter. She's just not. She talks sense, agree with her policies or don't, but she speaks English. Trump, the stuff that comes out of his mouth, at these rallies is crazy, and a lot of it goes unreported. A lot of it just goes unreported. So I talked about this one episode. He spoke, as people know, at Moms for Liberty over the weekend. And he went on this riff, and, it's such a Trumpy riff. Maybe reporters are just tired of it and don't think it's news. I think it's news. He goes on this riff, and he talks about a kid goes off to school, and, 15 minutes later, or 15 days later, or whatever it is, they come back with an operation. And they're a different sex. And how did this happen? How did this happen? No, I'm sorry. That doesn't happen. That's insane. That doesn't remotely happen. Schools don't perform, sexual reassignment surgery. They don't. This was a crazy thing to say, but also a very toxic thing to say. And I went and looked at the way the New York Times covered that speech and the way the Washington Post covered that speech, and neither of them even mentioned it. And the Los Angeles Times did say that he, made attacks on transgender people in its headline, but they didn't use this quote. They didn't really burrow into the story. So all this stuff has the effect of just normalizing Donald Trump and making him seem like he's a regular candidate out there saying regular things. He's not. He's a dangerous and kind of deranged person out there saying dangerous and kind of deranged things, but it doesn't come through in the mainstream media.
I think one of the big problems with this, Michael, is that the Republican base is primed to believe his lies. I mean, we've gone from 10 or 12% of Republicans believing that Trump won the 2020 election in the weeks immediately following the election to over 70% now, simply because that big lie has been repeated over and over and over again. And, it's just, how do we, here's another one, for example. He's saying that Democrats, and in 6 Democratic states now, you can abort a baby after it's born. I don't even know what to say about that, but why does the media, why isn't this a headline?
You got me. That's a great question. It may have been a headline somewhere. Maybe somewhere along the line, the New York Times has run one story that says, Trump regularly spreads falsehoods about Democrats' abortion position. But it's not enough. And then that enables the Times to say, oh, we covered it. But it's not enough to do it one time or 3 times when he's out there doing it every day. And he's out there saying that Kamala Harris wants you to be able to abort your child or fetus right up to the moment of birth. No, she doesn't. Nobody wants that. Nobody in the world thinks that. And certainly she doesn't think that. And why even, there's a certain point, like if you're electronic media, why even broadcast it? I understand why if you're Fox, they're a propaganda network. But, if you're another network, Why even broadcast it? Don't let that get on the air to begin with. Don't give it any oxygen.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. You know, Franklin Roosevelt confronted an awful lot of lies. You know, Hamilton Fish was actually taking money from Adolf Hitler in the 30s and attacking Roosevelt and things like that. And Roosevelt had a comment about this. I want to share it with you real quickly and get your thoughts on how modern day politicians could reprise something like this.
Remember, a number of years ago, there was a book, Mein Kampf, written by Hitler himself. The technique was all set out in Hitler's book, and it was copied by the aggressors of Italy and Japan. According to that technique, you should never use a small falsehood, always a big one, for its very fantastic nature would make it more credible. If only you keep repeating it over and over and over again.
We are literally seeing this right now.
We are. We're living right through this. And you know, the press is just, you know, they, in individual cases, yes, they'll rebut these things. But their general stance as the Fourth Estate, our general stance, I should say, although it certainly isn't mine. The general stance as a Fourth Estate is doing that kind of policing just isn't our job. So I write this in the piece that you cited earlier. Journalism, mainstream journalism, objective journalism, is driven by two values, truth and accuracy on the one hand, and on the other, fairness. And this is what, you know, I went to journalism school, and this is what they taught me. You've got to be, what you write obviously has to be true, and it has to be accurate, and you need to be fair. You need to be fair to both sides. You need to quote people from both sides, or if there are three sides, all three sides of the story, and not give too much weight, and not give a happy adjective to this one and a dour adjective to that one. These are fine things, you know. These are okay things to try to aspire to and to try to live by. And usually, if there's, you know, under normal circumstances, truth and fairness aren't really in conflict. Today, in American politics, they are deeply in conflict because you have one side that, you know, embellishes in the normal way politicians do. You know, I heard Tim Walz the other day talk about, you know, Trump wants to increase the retirement age. Well, I don't know. But anyway, that's a normal kind of political embellishment. But then we have another side that just lies aggressively about everything exactly the way that FDR described. How fair are the media obliged to be to a side that just lies all the time in big ways about everything? And yet that's where we are. And I think a lot of these outlets, when forced to choose between telling the truth and being fair, you know, because they, God forbid, they don't want to be accused of being too liberal, they bend over backwards in the direction of fairness to Republicans and conservatives. And I see it, and I'm sure you see it, and I'm sure your listeners see it every day.
Yeah. To what extent do you think this is the consequence of Lee Atwater's work the ref strategy that he started, you know, back in the 80s, and that has been, you know, done to the point where it's almost an article of faith that the media in the United States is liberal, when in fact, you know, certainly the corporate ownership of it is not? Or on the other hand, to what extent might this be pressure coming from the top down? There have been a couple of stories purporting to essentially out the management at the New York Times because the publisher was pissed off that Joe Biden wouldn't do a sit-down interview with him when Donald Trump did. You know, I can't speak for the veracity of those claims, but you know, what's the why here? Why do you think this is happening beyond just, you know, you just mentioned, you know, the desire to have fairness?
Well, I think the Atwater narrative is a pretty good answer to why this is, and this goes back, Tom, as you know, farther than Lee Atwater. It goes back to Reed Irvine, who founded this group, Accuracy in Media, in 1969. So that's a long time ago.
Yep.
And he got sit-downs with the editors of editorial pages at the major newspapers to try to explain to them where their liberal bias was. And in some cases, he probably had a point. But now, today, that has morphed into these papers, these liberal papers, the New York Times and the Washington Post and others. And they are liberal to the extent that their editorial pages typically endorse Democrats. But that doesn't describe their news pages. Their news pages, you know, they may make liberal presumptions about cultural issues, you know, like if there's a story about a gay couple trying to adopt a child, it'll probably be a sympathetic story. And thank goodness for that. It should be. So you can call that, I guess, liberal if you want to. But in terms of the hard political coverage, there's no liberal bias. There's no liberal bias at all. If anything, there's a little bit of a conservative bias precisely because they're so afraid of being called liberal.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Michael Tomasky, he's the editor of The New Republic. His new piece, The Media Are About to Help Trump Fail His Way Back to the White House. newrepublic.com is the website, or tnr.com. Michael, thanks so much for dropping by. It's great talking with you.
Thanks for having me. Real pleasure.
Always a pleasure.